in the rugged mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico, a network of farmers and smugglers transformed into one of the most powerful criminal empires in history. Born from poverty, betrayal, and ambition, the Sinaloa Cartel rose from dusty backroads to dominate the global drug trade, an empire built on loyalty, violence, and silence. It began in the valleys of Sinaloa, where the mountains meet the Pacific and the land itself seems to breed both poverty and defiance. In the 1970s, as marijuana and opium fields blanketed the countryside, local farmers found a new kind of prosperity in the soil, one not sanctioned by the government, but by the demands of a growing black market to the north. The United States' appetite for drugs was rising fast, and Sinaloa's isolation, loyalty, and geography made it the perfect breeding ground for an empire. Before the Sinaloa Cartel had a name, there was the Guadalajara Cartel, led by Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino. He was the architect who first united Mexico's traffickers under one organization, ensuring cooperation instead of bloodshed. His operation linked small, time growers and smugglers from Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, the region known as the Golden Triangle, into a network that moved Colombian cocaine across Mexico and into the United States. At the time, Félix Gallardo's reach extended from the Pacific coast to the U.S. border, protected by powerful allies in law enforcement and politics. Among his subordinates were men who would later shape Mexico's narco history: Ernesto, Don Nitu, Fonseca Carrillo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and a quiet but sharp trafficker from Sinaloa named Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo. Guzman started as a logistics man, ensuring shipments crossed borders and profits returned. His efficiency, brutality, and ability to remain unnoticed caught the attention of the cartel's leaders. But while Félix Gallardo built alliances through negotiation and wealth, Guzman's rise was built on speed, secrecy, and ruthless ambition. In 1985, the empire began to fracture. The kidnapping, torture, and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in Guadalajara ignited the full force of the United States government against the cartel. The incident brought unprecedented scrutiny to Mexican traffickers and forced the disbanding of Félix Gallardo's centralized structure. When he was arrested in 1989, Mexico's trafficking world splintered into factions, each led by former lieutenants who claimed territory and routes. From that chaos, the Sinaloa Cartel emerged. The Sinaloans had deep roots in the drug trade, generations of smuggling routes carved through mountains and coastal towns. Guzman, alongside Hector Luis Palma Salazar, known as El Guerrero, and later Ismael El Mayo Zambada, began consolidating power in the state's rugged terrain. Their strength lay not just in violence, but in business strategy. They diversified production, refined transport, and built a hierarchy that balanced loyalty with profit. The Sinaloa Cartel's early years were marked by fierce rivalries, with the Tijuana Cartel led by the Arellano Félix brothers, and the Juárez cartel under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, but also by an uncanny ability to survive. By the mid-1990s, Guzman had become a legend of sorts. His operations stretched from Culiacan to the U.S. border, smuggling cocaine, heroin, and marijuana through tunnels, trucks, and even canned chili shipments. He paid local farmers for poppy and marijuana cultivation, ensuring loyalty in remote regions. But his empire drew the attention of authorities and rivals alike. In 1993, after a failed assassination attempt at the Guadalajara airport that killed a Catholic cardinal by mistake, Guzman was captured in Guatemala and handed over to Mexican authorities. Many believed it was the end of his reign. It wasn't. While imprisoned in Puente Grande, Guzman continued to run his operations through bribes and coded messages. The cartel adapted, using front companies, fake export firms, and local gangs to maintain control. El Mayo Zambada became the bridge between Guzman and the outside world, a man as elusive as he was strategic. Together, they redefined cartel leadership, not just through fear, but through a corporate-style structure that managed logistics, finances, and recruitment across borders. In 2001, Guzman escaped Puente Grande hidden in a laundry cart, an event that humiliated the Mexican government and made him a folk hero to some and a ghost to others. His escape marked a turning point. Over the next decade, the Sinaloa Cartel transformed from a regional trafficking group into a multinational powerhouse. They forged alliances with Colombian producers, eliminated rivals through precision violence, and used tunnels beneath the U.S. border to move tons of cocaine and methamphetamine undetected. At its core, Sinaloa's strength was adaptability. When Colombian cartels collapsed under U.S. pressure, Sinaloa stepped in to control distribution. When new synthetic drugs gained popularity, they expanded production. The cartel infiltrated ports, airports, and customs, embedding itself into the infrastructure of trade. It wasn't just about smuggling, it was logistics, timing, and control of entire routes from South America to North America, Europe, and Asia. Their influence spread deep into politics and law enforcement. Corruption wasn't a side effect, it was a strategy. Local police, federal agents, even military officials were bought, threatened, or replaced. In many regions, the cartel acted as an unofficial government, resolving disputes and enforcing order in areas the state had long abandoned. They built schools, sponsored local festivals, and provided jobs, blending crime with a twisted form of community service that earned them protection and silence. The early 2000s also saw the rise of new enemies. The Gulf Cartel and its paramilitary arm, Los Zetas, challenged Sinaloa's dominance through brutal tactics and military precision. In response, Sinaloa formed alliances with smaller groups, creating a federation known as the Federación, a coalition of traffickers united against common rivals. It was less about unity and more about survival, a temporary peace among wolves. Under Guzman and Zambada's direction, Sinaloa perfected the use of plazas, strategic territories that controlled border crossings and trade corridors. Each plaza operated semi-independently, managed by local bosses who paid tribute to the higher command. This decentralized model allowed flexibility and made it harder for law enforcement to dismantle the structure. Even when key figures were captured, operations continued without interruption. By 2008, Mexico's government under President Felipe Calderón launched a full-scale war against the cartels, deploying the military across the country. Sinaloa, despite being the primary target, continued to expand. Their command of supply chains, intelligence networks, and financial operations made them resilient. While other cartels fractured under pressure, Sinaloa absorbed their remnants, spreading across Mexico's western corridor from Baja California to Sonora, Durango, and Chihuahua. Guzman's legend grew as he evaded capture time after time. His escapes became part of Mexican folklore, blending fact with myth. In Sinaloa's hills, people whispered that he could predict raids, that soldiers warned him before operations began. The truth was simpler. His network of informants, local support, and corruption was vast. He paid farmers for silence, mayors for protection, and soldiers for blindness. At the same time, Sinaloa's reach extended beyond Mexico. They established operations in the United States through intermediaries, working with gangs like the Mexican Mafia and the Shuri Oz. In Europe, Their cocaine shipments arrived in Spain and the Netherlands. In Asia, precursor chemicals for methamphetamine came from China, refined in Mexico, and sent north. The Sinaloa Cartel had become a global syndicate. Within Mexico, power shifted between its leaders. El Mayo remained the invisible hand, older, cautious, and business-minded, while Guzman became the public face, reckless and ambitious. Together they maintained balance, but beneath the surface, tensions brewed. As new generations entered the trade, Guzman's sons, known as Los Chapitos, began carving their influence, often clashing with older commanders. The organization's unity depended on careful negotiation, and few understood that better than El Mayo. Violence was never absent. The battle for key smuggling routes, especially along the U.S. border in Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez, turned cities into war zones. Thousands were killed in gunfights, ambushes, and public executions. Civilians suffered the collateral damage of a war between invisible armies. Yet even in chaos, Sinaloa's leadership managed to keep the business running. Drugs moved, money flowed, and the world's demand never slowed. Guzman's capture in 2014 was a global spectacle. Marines raided a safe house in Mazatlan after months of surveillance, finally bringing down the man who had eluded capture for over a decade. For a moment, it seemed the empire might crumble, but the cartel structure held firm. Within months, El Mayo and the remaining leadership continued operations as if nothing had changed. 2 years later, in 2016, Guzman escaped again through a tunnel dug directly into his prison cell, an escape that once more exposed the deep corruption within the system. His final arrest in 2016 and extradition to the United States in 2017 marked the end of an era, but not of the organization he helped build. The Sinaloa Cartel was no longer dependent on one man. It had become an institution, one that operated like a multinational corporation with divisions for logistics, finance, enforcement, and international trade. Even behind bars, Guzman's name carried weight, but the machine kept moving. The first half of the Sinaloa Cartel's story is not one of a single man's rise, but of a system that learned to outlive its creators. From the fields of Sinaloa to the streets of Chicago, from the jungles of Colombia to the ports of Rotterdam, its influence spread like a network of veins pumping money and power through a global underworld. It thrived on instability, fed by corruption, and sustained by demand, a mirror to both the poverty that birthed it and the wealth that sustained it. The arrest of Joaquin, El Chapo, Guzman in 2014 sent shockwaves through the underworld. He was cornered in a beachfront villa in Mazatlan after months of surveillance. Soldiers burst in, weapons blazing, and Guzman surrendered. In that moment, many thought the empire would shatter. But the structure held firm. While he was escorted into custody, the networks he built continued humming. What this really meant was that the organization he helped create had grown beyond one man. His arrest became a turning point, not an end. Immediately afterward, the leadership of the Sinaloa Cartel shifted. Ismael, El Mayo, Zambada, older and more discreet, who long had been Guzman's partner, assumed greater influence. He had always favored a quieter, long-term game, build alliances, control routes, diversify product lines. Under his hand, the cartel spread its reach further abroad. In the United States, they deepened distribution hubs West Coast, Southwest border, Chicago, Atlanta. In Latin America, they entrenched relationships with Colombian producers. In Asia, they helped secure precursor chemicals from China. Smuggling tunnels, hidden compartments, deep corruption. These remained the tools of the trade. Around the mid-2010s, the market began shifting. Plant-based drugs, marijuana, heroin, still important, but synthetic drugs were rising. Methamphetamine surged, and by the late 2010s the cartel began to move into fentanyl, a synthetic opioid many times stronger than heroin. The United States overdose crisis grew in parallel. The Sinaloa network had been quietly adapting, refining manufacturing, sourcing chemicals, expanding shipment channels. Factories hidden in remote terrain, labs underground, stockpiles awaiting export. Their business model had matured. In 2016, Guzman escaped again, this time through a tunnel dug into his prison cell. For most, the escape seemed mythical. A secret passage equipment, guards bribed, the works. The Mexican government was humiliated. But the operation revealed something crucial. The cartel's reach into the state apparatus, into the very walls of its prisons, was profound. When Guzman was recaptured after months on the run and extradited to the United States in 2017, he would never run the field again. But by then, he didn't need to. The institution he built ran itself. As Guzman sat behind bars, the internal dynamics shifted. The sons of El Chapo, collectively called Los Chapitos, Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, Joaquin Guzman Elquis Pérez, began to assert themselves. The older guard around El Mayo and other lieutenants wrestled with them for influence. What this looked like behind the scenes: territories quietly reassigned, alliances renegotiated, loyalties tested. The cartel's horizontal structure, semi-autonomous cells paying tribute to central command, allowed for this transition without collapse. By the late 2010s, the cartel held primacy in many regions: Sinaloa, Sonora, Durango, Chihuahua, along the Pacific Corridor, and deep into the U.S. The U.S. government estimated that from 1990 to 2008 the cartel had imported hundreds of metric tons of cocaine, along with large amounts of heroin. They controlled key U.S. distribution hubs: Chicago's Little Village, Phoenix, Los Angeles. The illicit supply chains were long and deep: South America to Mexico to the U.S. Money laundering through banks, real estate, shell companies. The cartel was a global enterprise, sprawling and resilient. Yet dominance also painted a target on their backs. The Mexican government under President Felipe Calderón, 2006-2012, had launched a militarized offensive. Troops poured into cartel hotspots. Thousands were killed. Disappearances soared. With Guzman in U.S. custody, rivals saw openings. The Jalisco New Generation cartels, CJNG, rose as a fierce competitor, particularly in western Mexico and the Pacific Central Corridor. The Sinaloa Cartel responded by forming alliances, creating the so-called Federation, flexible coalitions with smaller groups to hold territory and counter threats. The war spilled into streets. Border cities, highways, tunnels, warehouses, all battlegrounds. Throughout this, Sinaloa's strategy remained the same: diversify, decentralize, corrupt. They bribed federal officials, infiltrated police and military, turned mayors and governors into allies, or paid protectors. Localities where the state had weak presence became cartel space: schools built, festivals sponsored, jobs offered. The cartel functioned in parallel with the government in some regions. In effect, the business of moving drugs, laundering money, and keeping the roads open became the business of governing, or at least shadow governing. By the 2020s, the landscape changed again. Fentanyl overshadowed cocaine. Laboratories were no longer hidden in the jungle alone, but covert in suburbs. Precursor chemicals shipped by sea, air, land from Asia via Central America into Mexico. In 2024, reports flagged a major internal rift. The two factions, Los Chapitos and the El Mayo camp, began an open struggle. The arrest of Zambada in the United States in mid-2024 triggered violence. Roadblocks, mass shootings, Decapitations marked territories around Culiacan. Families fled their homes, schools shut, the state apparatus weakened. What this really meant was that even empires built for resilience can crack when succession, ambition, and pressure converge. Across the border, the US continued its push. Operation Accelerator in 2009 had arrested over 750 suspected traffickers linked to Sinaloa and seized tens of millions of dollars. But the shipments kept coming. Money still flowed. In 2012, the bank HSBC paid billions in fines for laundering Mexican cartel money, including funds tied to Sinaloa. Law enforcement became global extraditions, asset seizures, international coordination. Still, the network adapted. In Mexico, the cartel shifted its attention to new zones of violence. States like Zacatecas, Michoacán, and Chihuahua became contested. In some places, the CJNG and Sinaloa fought for control. In others, local splinter groups switched allegiance. The golden trajectory of Sinaloa's empire was no longer simply expansion. It became survival, adaptation, internal war. By 2025, analysts mark the Sinaloa Cartel as the most enduring of Mexico's major organizations. While Guzman remains incarcerated in the US, the cartel persists through its surviving leadership, its financial systems, its international reach. The fentanyl crisis in the US is tied to the supply chains they control. Money laundering extended through China, precursor chemicals via Asia. The cartel is no longer just a trafficking organization, it's an industrial platform. Still, the rift within now threatened that platform. Violence in Sinaloa state flew past any previous benchmark. Mass graves, public executions, guerrilla-style battles. The El Mayo vs. Los Chapitos war exposed the fragility beneath the facade of control. What looked like invincibility turned out to be a coalition of strongmen and lieutenants, each with ambitions of their own. In that broken mirror of power, one sees the arc of the Sinaloa story. From smugglers in the mountains to global kingpins, from unified command under Félix Gallardo to decentralized franchise under Guzman and Zambada, from agricultural opium fields to synthetic chemical labs. And in this second half, the lesson is clear: the cartel adapted, survived, and now fights itself as much as it fights the state. The story of the Sinaloa Cartel is far from over. The world's largest drug market remains to the north. Demand ensures supply. Roads shift when one gate closes. The modules of power, money, violence, corruption, geography, remain stacked in the favor of those who can manage them. And for now, the Sinaloa Cartel still does.